Stonewall Asylum was once a place where the most disturbed minds were sent, hidden away from society's eyes. Located in the middle of a dense forest, the asylum was abandoned in the 1950s after a series of mysterious disappearances of patients and staff alike. Local rumors claimed the asylum was haunted by the souls of those who suffered in its walls. Yet, for decades, it remained a looming, decaying relic, forgotten by most until a group of urban explorers decided to venture inside. Daniel, a skeptic of the paranormal, led the group. He was determined to debunk the legends surrounding the asylum. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of adventure, they arrived at the asylum just as the sun set behind the treeline, casting a foreboding shadow over the building. Its facade, once grand and imposing, was now a crumbling mess of ivy-covered brick and shattered windows. The front door was padlocked, but they found a side entrance that had partially collapsed, revealing a narrow passage. They squeezed through, their flashlights piercing the darkness inside. The interior was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Paint peeled from the walls, and debris littered the floor. The corridors stretched on like endless labyrinths, each lined with rusted, iron doors that seemed to groan in protest as they walked by. As they ventured deeper, they found the patient cells, each one a small, claustrophobic space with a single, rusted bed frame. They reached what appeared to be the main hall, where the walls were scrawled with writings in an unfamiliar language, and symbols that made their skin crawl. "This place really knew how to create nightmares," muttered Sarah, one of the explorers. She aimed her camera at the strange markings. As she snapped photos, her camera screen flickered violently. "That's weird," she said, frowning. "Old equipment," Daniel replied, dismissing it. But then his flashlight flickered, casting brief, unsettling shadows along the walls. As they continued exploring, they reached the heart of the asylum, the operating theater. The room had an oppressive atmosphere, and the remnants of medical equipment lay scattered around. In the center stood an old, blood-stained operating table. Above it hung a rusted surgical light, its bulb shattered. "Looks like this was where they performed the lobotomies," Daniel said, moving closer to inspect the table. The air grew colder, their breath now visible in front of them. A sense of dread washed over the group. Suddenly, they heard a faint, metallic scraping sound, like a scalpel dragging across a metal tray. They froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Did anyone else hear that?" whispered Lisa, her voice barely audible. "Probably just the wind," Daniel replied, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. Then they heard it again, louder this time. It was followed by a low, whispering chant that seemed to emanate from all around them. The air grew thick, pressing in on them from all sides. They backed away from the table, their flashlights now flickering uncontrollably. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They rushed to it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incoherent cacophony. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, pounding on the door. Daniel scanned the room with his flashlight, its beam darting frantically. That's when they saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadows. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and unnatural, almost like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "Who are you?" Daniel shouted, trying to mask his fear. The figure raised its arm, pointing toward the operating table. In that moment, the temperature dropped further, and they could hear faint screams, as if echoing through time. The walls began to close in, warping and twisting. "Let's get out of here," Lisa screamed, and they turned back to the door, kicking and slamming against it with all their strength. Finally, the door gave way, and they stumbled into the corridor. They sprinted through the asylum's maze-like hallways, the whispers and scraping sounds chasing after them. Shadows flickered on the walls, contorting into monstrous shapes. They reached the collapsed side entrance, scrambling through the narrow gap. As they emerged into the forest, the asylum let out a deep, groaning sound, like a beast in pain. Gasping for breath, they looked back at the asylum. It stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless. Did that really happen? Sarah panted, clutching her camera. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. They left the forest, vowing never to return. Later, when they reviewed the footage from the camera, they found something chilling. In every frame of the operating room, there was a shadowy figure standing by the table, watching them. And in the background, faint but unmistakable, they heard the whisper, "You can never leave." Fairgrove Park was once the pride of a small town, its roller coasters and bright lights drawing visitors from miles around. But a tragic accident in the 1970s claimed the lives of several children on one of its most popular rides, the Devil's Wheel. Following the tragedy, the park shut down, its gates locked, and rides left to rust and decay. Over time, it became a local legend, a place cursed by the restless spirits of the children who perished there. Mark, Jenna, and Chris, three adrenaline junkies with a love for the paranormal, decided to spend the night in the park. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and ghost-hunting gadgets, they climbed over the rusted fence as the moon hung high above them, casting an eerie glow over the dilapidated attractions. The park was a twisted shell of its former self. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, and the once vibrant paint on the rides had faded and peeled away, leaving only rust and decay. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional creak of metal as the wind passed through. "Welcome to the happiest place on earth," Chris joked, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. They moved toward the center of the park, where the Devil's Wheel loomed. Its giant, rusted metal frame groaned as if protesting their presence. As they approached, their equipment started to glitch. The temperature sensors dropped, and the EMF meter spiked. "Looks like we've got some activity," Jenna said, trying to sound excited, though her eyes darted nervously around the area. Mark set up his camera on a tripod to film the ride. "All right, let's see if we can make contact," he said, turning on his voice recorder. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint sound filled the air, the creaking of metal. The wheel began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The rusted seats swung violently, despite the fact that there was no power running to the park. "Did you see that?" Jenna gasped, pointing to one of the seats. In the dim light, they could see a shadowy figure sitting there, swinging back and forth. Mark grabbed his camera, zooming in on the seat. The figure was that of a child, its face obscured by darkness. As the wheel turned, the figure's head slowly lifted, revealing hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare directly at them. "Is this a joke?" Chris stammered, taking a step back. "No, it's not," Mark replied, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Suddenly, the park came alive. Lights flickered on the carousel, casting eerie shadows as its horses began to move up and down. The music from the funhouse blared, warped and distorted, echoing through the park. The arcade games lit up, their screens flashing random images. The trio turned to run, but the pathways twisted and changed, leading them deeper into the park. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, disorienting their sense of direction. They heard laughter, childish and manic, echoing from all around. "Where'd we go?" Jenna cried, clutching her flashlight as it flickered. "This way," Mark yelled, pointing to a narrow alley between two food stalls. They sprinted through it, emerging into a clearing with an old, broken-down bumper car ride. The car sat motionless, covered in dust and cobwebs. Then, one of the cars jolted forward, scraping along the metal floor. It was followed by another, and then another. The cars moved toward them, their headlights flickering on with an unnatural red glow. "Run!" Chris shouted, pushing Mark and Jenna toward a gate that seemed to lead back to the park's entrance. They sprinted, the bumper cars pursuing them with a grinding, metallic screech. They reached the gate and threw themselves against it, desperately trying to pry it open. It groaned, resisting for a moment before finally giving way. They stumbled through, collapsing onto the ground outside the park's perimeter. Gasping for breath, they looked back. The park was dark and silent once more, its rides motionless. "What just happened?" Chris panted, clutching his chest. "I don't know," Mark replied, staring at his camera. "But I think we caught something." Later, when they reviewed the footage, they discovered that during the entire ordeal, faint figures of children could be seen moving among the rides. And in every frame, the same whispering chant could be heard, "Come play with us, forever." Eldon's Point Lighthouse stood at the edge of a rocky coastline, its beam once guiding ships safely through treacherous waters. Built in the 1800s, it had seen its fair share of storms and shipwrecks. But what made it infamous was the disappearance of its last keeper, Jeremiah Cole, over a century ago. Legends say he went mad during a particularly fierce storm and vanished, leaving the lighthouse forever cursed. Emily and her brother Michael, both history enthusiasts, decided to explore the lighthouse. They were fascinated by its dark history and hoped to uncover clues about the mysterious disappearance. Arriving at dusk, they made their way to the lighthouse, its tall, shadowy form looming against the blood-red sky. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a spiral staircase leading upward into darkness. The air was damp and salty, carrying the faint scent of old, rotting wood. As they climbed, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and echoing through the hollow structure. "This place is giving me the creeps," Michael muttered as they reached the first landing. "Come on, it's just an old lighthouse," Emily replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. They continued upward, the steps creaking beneath their feet. They reached the top, where the lantern room awaited. The glass was fogged with age, but they could still see the ocean waves crashing against the rocks far below. In the center stood the massive, old lens, dusty and covered in cobwebs. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a journal lying on a small wooden table. It was worn and yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, revealing the last entries of Jeremiah Cole. "The storm grows stronger. I see them now, the shadows in the fog, they call to me." Emily shivered. "It's his journal," she whispered. He really was losing his mind. Before Michael could respond, the wind outside intensified, and the room grew colder. The journal's pages began to flip on their own, as if an unseen hand were turning them. Then, the light above them flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Did you see that?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," Emily replied, backing away from the table. The temperature continued to drop, and they could see their breath misting in the air. Suddenly, they heard it, a low, mournful wail, like the cry of a ship's foghorn. It echoed through the room, vibrating through the metal and stone. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the spiral staircase. "Who's there?" Emily called out, though she feared the answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They turned to the staircase, their flashlights aimed downward, but there was no one there. Yet the footsteps continued, relentless, until they reached the landing. A figure materialized in the dim light, a man in an old keeper's uniform, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "It's him," Michael gasped. "Jeremiah Cole." The figure stepped forward, raising an arm to point toward the window. Outside, the storm raged, and through the fog, they could see the outlines of ships, ghostly and translucent, sailing toward the rocky coast. "Save them," the figure rasped, his voice a blend of desperation and sorrow. "Save them from the rocks." Emily and Michael stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The figure turned toward the lens, its light flickering and growing dim. The room filled with an overpowering sense of dread, pressing in on them like the weight of the sea itself. Suddenly, the light flared, blinding them. When they could see again, the room was empty. The figure was gone, and the journal lay open on the table. They ran to the staircase, stumbling down the steps, desperate to escape the lighthouse's grip. As they burst through the front door, the storm outside had vanished, leaving only the quiet sound of the waves. They looked back at the lighthouse, its beam now shining steady and bright, cutting through the fog. "What just happened?" Emily whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "I don't know," Michael replied, still shaking. "But I think he saved us." Later, when they reviewed the journal, they found a final, unseen entry on the last page. Written in a hurried scrawl, it read, "The light must guide them, even in death." And as they left Eldon's Point, they knew one thing: the lighthouse keeper was still there, forever bound to guide lost souls through the storm.